Welcome to BIA, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for shows on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best content the black community in Canada has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do it. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
Nonviolent, even though Africans always have to pay with blood for even the most minor of advancements. We always have to pay with blood, but for the most part, the first stage of independence was relatively nonviolent. When we get to the second stage in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, up until the apartheid ended in 1994, it gets more and more of a violent struggle. So we'll talk about these two things. We'll also talk about some of the ways that the African independence movement was also influencing what was going on in the diaspora. So we'll be going back and forth like we do all for the past couple of weeks, because we're talking about African world history. The other important thing I want to point out, today we're talking about Algeria. Oftentimes there's this tendency when we talk about African history to treat North Africa as if it's not a part of Africa, as if it's a part of the Arab world or the Middle East or something like that. But we're not going to do that in this class, because we know that when we talk about the African continent, we're talking about the entire continent. And in particular with Algeria, we're talking about a nation that aligned itself from the jump with African anti-colonial policies. And we're going to talk about the great African revolutionary psychiatrist, philosopher, Frantz Fanon, who represents what Algeria was at this time, a beacon of pan-African revolutionary activity. So we're going to talk about that. Our key term for today is, and just to kind of bring us to where we're at in terms of time, we are moving into the second half of the 20th century today. So we've covered a lot of this information from 1896, and today we're going to go, like I said, from this event, 1945, the Fifth Pan-African Congress, to about 1962. So if you can get a visual of the timeline that we're in. Okay. The key term for today is Daniel, is that you sharing? You don't have to share. Not today, because we got it set up. So yeah, thanks. Not yet, not to the video. Key term for today that you should know. We're talking about settler colonialism. It's a very particular type of colonialism, and this definition comes from an encyclopedia entry by Adrian P. Flores in 2017. Settler colonialism relates to the mass transfer, and you could share this, the mass transfer of family units from a metropolis to colonial outposts in order to populate those particular geographical locales with colonial stock. What does that mean? A lot of big words like metropolis and colonial outposts. What we're talking about is colonialism where the folks want land. We're talking about places like Canada, places like the United States, places like Australia, places like South Africa, places like Algeria, Kenya, Israel. These are settler colonies. These are places where folks came from the metropolis or the colonial power to actually take over land and live in these areas. Settler colonialism is a lot more difficult to defeat than traditional colonialism. Places like Ghana, Nigeria, you didn't have a whole lot of Europeans coming to live there. You had colonial administrators and missionaries and people like that, but not a whole wave of migration the way we have in Kenya, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Algeria, etc. So we're going to talk about the struggle in Algeria to defeat settler colonialism. It looks a lot different than some of the other places that we'll start our discussion out with today. Thanks. All right, so one of the most seminal events in African world history, the Fifth Pan-African Congress, 1945, Manchester, England. This is after World War II ends. The Africans are seeing that after the great European tribal war, the European powers, France, England, they're weak. So now there's another chance, just like at the end of World War I, it's another chance to get greater freedom. Except this time, they're not just asking for self-government. They're not just asking for a softer form of colonialism. The mantra now in this generation is independence now. And we've talked about this Congress in other classes. We've talked about the personalities, the Kwame Nkrumahs, the George Padmores of Trinidad, Amy Ashwood Garvey, who opens up the Congress, W.E.B. Du Bois, who's an elder at this time, who had organized the previous 4 Pan-African Congresses and also attended the one that we talked about in earlier, the 1900 First Pan-African Conference. So Du Bois is the elder at this time, but he helps put this together. And we see Africans from all over the continent, mostly English-speaking Africans, come with the goal of using this conference to organize, to plan about getting independence now. This is a much bolder Congress. Amy Ashwood starts it off and she tells the mostly male audience, the mostly male delegates, to remember that when you're fighting for freedom, this is also a fight that women are going to participate in. And they want a nation that's going to respect women's rights as well. So Amy Ashwood put it out there to make sure that the men remember. So this is a seminal event in African world history. So after this, the delegates, particularly folks like Nkrumah, they go back to their colonies and they start organizing. Nkrumah goes back to what's then called the Gold Coast with the United Gold Coast Convention at first. These are folks like J.B. Donkor and others who are organizing to get the British out of the Gold Coast. Nkrumah was a part of that organization at first, but he, along with many of the youth, feel like the elders are going too slow. Their demands aren't forceful enough, and Nkrumah ends up breaking to form the Convention People's Party. Now, Nkrumah has a grand plan that we're going to get to in a minute. It's not just about Ghana. I mean, it's not just about the Gold Coast. That's just step one in the plan. The Gold Coast getting independence is just step one. And like I said, Ghana was a place where you didn't have a whole lot of whites wanting to live. It wasn't a settler colony. So when Ghana fought for independence, Ghana was able to use what Nkrumah called positive action, a lot of nonviolent strategies to get independence. Strikes, demonstrations, protests like that. But even with that, there still was African bloodshed. One of the things that sparked the independence movement in Ghana was the shooting down of Ghanaian soldiers who had fought in the European tribal war for the British, who were fighting to get, I think it was back pay and some other grievances addressed, and they were shot down in the streets. So the Ghanaian population are looking at this and saying, we fought for you, we fought in your tribal war, things were promised, now we really want independence. So that was granted, and eventually in 1957, some 12 years after the Pan-African Congress, Ghana gets independence. It's the first country south of the Sahara to get independence. And at independence, part of the remaking of the country, and Nkrumah's party wins, Nkrumah becomes the prime minister, and they changed the name from the Gold Coast to Ghana, a name representative of an ancient African empire. That's not where Ghana is now. The ancient Ghana is closer to Mauritania than it is to where Ghana is, but that's the name that was chosen in 1957. And at Ghana's independence, we have folks like Martin Luther King Jr., who was in attendance at Ghana's independence. And this is a letter that you can find in the digitized Martin Luther King papers of Stanford University, where it's the invitation that Nkrumah sent to Martin Luther King. Remember, Nkrumah had studied in the United States. He went to Lincoln University. He knew the struggle of African Americans. He was influenced by Marcus Garvey. And again, Garvey's name is going to keep coming up. We're going to talk about another one of Garvey's disciples a little bit later. But Nkrumah said Garvey's message changed his life. So for Nkrumah, the struggle for African people, it wasn't just about what was going on in Ghana. It was about the entire continent and also about the entire African world, wherever Africans found themselves. So he read about the bus boycott in Montgomery. He read about something's going on the screen. He read about the nonviolent movement of Martin Luther King, and he invited him to the independence celebrations in Ghana. And Nkrumah was there, King was there, and he enjoyed his time there. And there were other African Americans who saw Ghana as the new symbol. So we're moving from Haiti in the 19th century, Ethiopia in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Now Ghana is a new symbol of Pan-African hope and the future. So, and King is there. Other African Americans are there. Africans from the diaspora are in Ghana for its independence. And Nkrumah says something very significant. The very night that the British flag goes down and the new Ghanaian flag with that black star in the middle comes up. And Nkrumah says, Ghana's independence is meaningless unless it's tied up with the independence of the total liberation of the entire African continent. That was key, because for Nkrumah, Ghana was just step one. Because Nkrumah's vision was a United States of Africa. So he was going to use Ghana's resources to help all the other African countries that hadn't defeated colonization yet. So that's all the rest of them in sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia, to get independence. That was Nkrumah's mission. And he had the opportunity to practice this. 1 year later, we talked about last week about negritude and the French-speaking colonies in Africa and France's tactic of assimilation and all these things. Well, one political leader where France's assimilation policies didn't work was Ahmed Sékou Touré of Guinea. Sékou Touré was an organizer, a union activist who becomes the leading nationalist figure in Guinea. And in the late 1950s, as a result of one of the major things that we're going to talk about today, the French decided that realized that they weren't going to be able to hold on to their colonies in West and Central Africa as traditional colonies. They were going to have to figure out some new form of colonialism, what we now call neocolonialism, in order to continue to extract the resources and the labor from these territories. But they knew, because of what was going on politically, they weren't going to be able to hold on to them as colonies anymore. And for the most part, these places, well, all of these places in West and Central Africa were not settler colonies. So again, there's no white folks here. So they didn't have to deal with a white settler population that still wanted to be protected by France. So the French give their African colonies in Central and West Africa a choice. They say, you can join this French community that we're going to set up, where you have control over your internal affairs to a certain extent, but we are still your mother country. We can still control your foreign relations. You need to put a portion of your national treasury in a French bank. You need to align your currency to the French currency. All of these conditions. Senegal, Mali, Niger, Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, all of their leaders said, we agree to that. That's fine. And many of these leaders, remember, although they were negritudist, they were pushing African culture, they still couldn't get rid of that attachment to France. The only one that said no to this was Guinea. Guinea said no. We want complete independence. We don't want no parts of France anymore. Because of that, the French said, oh, that's how you're going to be? We're taking out all the infrastructure that we put into Guinea. We're taking out all the investments. We're going to be so petty. We're going to take telephone wires and telephone and things out of offices. We're going to make sure that you don't succeed as a new country without our help. They tried to cripple Guinea before Guinea was even born. That's where Ghana comes into the picture. That's where Nkrumah comes into the picture. Nkrumah sees this and he says, I said at independence that our freedom was meaningless unless it's tied up to the total liberation of the African continent. I'm going to show that I'm a man of my word. So I'm going to give Guinea and the PDG, Sekou Touré's political party, a loan. That it's not one of those IMF loans or World Bank loans with all types of strings attached. We're going to give you a loan. We're going to keep you solvent. We're going to make sure your economy is strong from the beginning, and we're going to use Ghana's money to do so. And he did that. And eventually, Nkrumah and Sekou Touré, and eventually Modibo Keita of Mali decided that they were going to form the nucleus of the United States of Africa by bringing their countries together in a union called the Ghana, Guinea, Mali Union. And by 1960, there was also a secret agreement that the Congo was going to be a part of this union. But we'll talk about that next week. But that was the plan. So Nkrumah's ideas for the United States of Africa are starting to come together. But then, at the same time that this is happening, and a little bit before, the most vicious, brutal, and impactful war for liberation is occurring in North Africa, in Algeria. Between 1954 and 1962, we have the independence movement and the war for liberation in Algeria. This is also often called France's Vietnam. Algeria was a settler colony. Algeria had been a settler colony since the 1830s and 40s. Algeria was one of the first true colonies in Africa. France, all the way back in the 1830s, had used the excuse of piracy. They said that there were Algerian pirates operating in this region. So France had to go into Algeria to stop that. This should sound familiar to anybody that pays attention to geopolitics today. There's always an excuse to invade. Let me go back. So the French had taken over Algeria very brutally in the 1830s and 40s, committed all types of atrocities, used scorched earth campaigns. That means they would come in and burn down all the crops, attack civilians, all these things. And the Algerians put up fierce resistance, even at that time. But they were ultimately, through divide and rule tactics and other things that would become hallmarks of colonial conquest later on in the 19th century, the French had taken over Algeria and then moved a number of French settlers into Algeria throughout the 19th century and going into the 20th century. And also other European settlers came into Algeria. Algerians were forced to be a part of the European tribal wars, both 1 and 2, and suffered extreme brutality from the racist ideas of the settlers that came in. The settlers not only controlled the land, they also controlled the politics, they controlled the economy. They made it so that the languages of the Algerians, whether we're talking about Berber dialects or Arabic, were only taught in religious schools and not taught in the main schools. I mean, what we saw with apartheid South Africa is very much similar to what was going on in Algeria. Although the French did try to say that, oh no, we let a certain amount of Algerians into the government. We do have our assimilation politics. All of that is going on. But this was a settler colony, like Kenya, like Zimbabwe, and the Algerians were ready after World War II. They saw France was weak, and they said, this is an opportunity to get independence. At first, they tried to do so non-violently. So from around 1945 to 1954, attempts were made by the Algerians to appeal to the French as Frenchmen, because Algeria was a part of France, technically. So they said, we're a part of France. We want to be treated better. We want equality. We want true representation in government. We want better economic outcomes, better educational outcomes. We want an end to the racism of the settlers. France would hear none of it. So eventually in 1945, there was a rebellion, a violent rebellion. It was crushed by the French and crushed violently by the French. So when the French responded to Algerian resistance, they not only attacked the perpetrators of the revolutionary violence, they also attacked the civilians. It was designed to terrorize the population into submission, but what it really did, it turned people that would not have been revolutionaries into revolutionaries. While all this is going on, a younger generation of Algerians, some of whom had actually fought for France in their tribal war to, liberate France from the Germans. It's funny. France is oppressing the Algerians and the other Africans, but when they got oppressed, when Hitler invaded France and meted out what the French was doing in Africa, then all of a sudden, we need everybody to come together. We need the Africans that are in Martinique and Guadeloupe to support the French. We need the Africans in West Africa to support the French to help us get our freedom. So many of the young Algerians had fought in World War II. And now they're ready to fight for their own freedom. They say, if France won't deal with us in a nonviolent way, listen to our elders who have been advocating for greater political representation, it's time to fight. So they planned and they organized and they formed something called the National Liberation Front, or in French, the FLN. The FLN was a secret organization that started to spread throughout the masses of Algeria. And they planned and they planned, and then they realized now was the time for the attack. And on November 1st, All Saints Day, 1954, the FLN made its appearance in a very dramatic way. Daniel, if you could load that video up. So we're talking about All Saints Day, and this is some footage from that fateful day in Algeria. And Daniel, make sure your sound is shared so that folks can hear it. Yeah, Daniel, I'm not sure is the sound shared? Can you hear it? Oh, here it goes. And if you could, Daniel, put the subtitles in English, because this is in French. All right. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks for showing that. All right. So that was just to give you a visual of kind of what was going on. So we're talking about on All Saints Day, 30 different orchestrated and planned attacks on key colonial outposts throughout Algeria. We're talking about military outposts, key places, attacks on settlers and their farms and plantations. And one of the things that really set off the Algerian Revolution, and one of the hallmarks of colonialism in Africa, there was a food shortage. Because the settlers, when they came into Algeria to control the land, they weren't producing food crops like cereals like wheat and sorghum and millet and all that type of stuff. They were producing wine for export. So they were using the arable land in Algeria. And this is mostly the land on the coast. As you go further in, you get into mountains and desert, but the land on the coast is incredibly fertile. And this is where the settlers had set up. So instead of growing food for the population, they're growing wine for export. We see this throughout Africa, where economies were transformed into duocrop or even monocrop economies for export. So instead of growing food, they're growing coffee. Instead of growing food, they're growing flowers for export, because the Europeans weren't concerned about feeding the populations in these African colonies. So the Algerians had nothing to lose. They were ready to fight. And they did so. And this was one of the most dramatic entries on the scene of a national liberation movement. 30 coordinated attacks in one day. The French weren't ready for it. And for the first 2 years of this struggle, from the FLN's appearance to 1956, the Algerians were winning the war, pretty much. They're using guerrilla tactics. They're not fighting the French head on. They know they don't have the military resources to do so, but they use hit and run attacks. They use what the French would call terrorism, even though it's really revolutionary violence. It's not really terrorism. And then the French will respond with collective punishments. Since they couldn't find the perpetrators, then they would just harass citizens, civilians who weren't even involved in the struggle. And what this does, it does the opposite of what the French wanted to do. It makes people who wouldn't be necessarily open to the idea of revolution more amenable to it. They say, if you want to attack us anyway, we might as well go out fighting. One of the key players in this is somebody that the French would never suspect to be a part of the FLN. And this is Frantz Fanon, who to this day is considered, if we look at all the statistics in terms of academic statistics, he's probably the most quoted person of African descent in academia. He's a philosopher, he's a psychiatrist, but for our purposes today, we're going to look at Fanon as those things, but also the revolutionary activist and representative of the Algerian Revolution. So he comes from Martinique. Martinique was the same island that Paulette Nardal and Aimé Césaire, who we talked about last week with Negritude, came from. And Martinique was considered a model French colony. We already talked about Paulette Nardal's approach to independence when she was asked about it. She said, yes, I believe in negritude and African culture is important and we have a lot to present to the French, but I think independence is stupid. This is what Paulette Nardal said. Aimé Césaire was much more radical. He writes Discourse on Colonialism, and he's also Frantz Fanon's teacher. Fanon would actually serve for the French, like so many other African youth around the world, in World War II. And it's during that time that he saw the racism of France. Because when you're in the colony, particularly a colony like Martinique, they didn't see outright French racism really until World War II, when French soldiers came into Martinique after the Germans had taken over France, and they brought that racism with them. And he talks about this. He says, before 1939, and if you wouldn't mind sharing this, there were about 2,000 Europeans in Martinique. These Europeans had well-defined functions, were integrated into the social life, involved in the country's economy. Now, from one day to the next, the single town of Fort-de-France was submerged by nearly 10,000 Europeans having an unquestionable, but until then latent racist mentality. The 4 years during which they were obliged to live shut in on themselves, inactive, a prey to anguish when they thought of their families left in France, victims of despair as to the future, allowed them to drop a mask, and masks are really important to Fanon, which, when it was all said and done, was rather superficial, and to behave as quote-unquote authentic racist. And this is from Fanon in an article he wrote called "The West Indian and the African." So World War II was a wake-up call for the folks in Martinique, and they got exposed to authentic racism. So Fanon would go from serving for the French to going to France after the war and earning a degree in psychiatry, his medical degree in psychiatry. And he wanted to publish this book dealing with the psychological effects of colonialism on colonized people. But his school wouldn't take it, so he ended up writing some. It was a good. I mean, he's a genius, so it was a good study, but it was something basic. He just got his degree, and then he went on to publish this book, Black Skin, White Mask, and this was Fanon using psychiatry, which at the time is a relatively new academic discipline. I mean, psychiatry really emerges in the late 19th, early 20th century. So he's one of the first, Black folks to get a degree in psychiatry. He does this, and he uses all the skills he has to try to analyze the effects of colonization on African people's minds. And now this is key to our whole class, because we're talking about the early history of the African Renaissance. In order to be reborn, in order for a Renaissance to happen, we got to free our minds. And he, like others like Carter G. Woodson in the 30s, who wrote The Miseducation of the Negro, were concerned about the effects of racism and colonialism on the African mind. And he writes this foundational text. If you haven't read this, you need to have it in your library. If you can read it in French, read it in French, because it's better to read it in its the way it was supposed to be read. But Black Skin, White Mask. I just want to point out one quote, and you can share this. He talks about the effects, particularly on children, in the chapter called, this is from the chapter called The Negro and Psychopathology. So he analyzes Black folks collectively as if Black folks were sitting on his couch as a psychotherapist. So he says, the Black schoolboy in the Antilles, who in his lessons is forever talking about, quote unquote, our ancestors, the Gauls, identifies himself with the explorer, the bringer of civilization, the white man who carries truth to savages in all white truth. There is identification, that is, the young Negro subjectively adopts a white man's attitude. Little by little, one can observe in the young Antillean the formation and crystallization of an attitude and a way of thinking and seeing that are essentially white. When in school, he has to read stories of savages told by white men. He always thinks of the Senegalese. As a schoolboy, I had many occasions to spend whole hours talking about the supposed customs of the savage Senegalese. So he's talking about this from the perspective of a West Indian who's under French colonialism in the West Indies, reading about the savage Senegalese. And what was said, there was a lack, and this, as this got translated, taken from one format to the other, you'll see that some of the letters got messed up. That's why I'm reading out loud. There was a lack of awareness that was at the very least paradoxical, because the Antillean does not think of himself as a Black man. He thinks of himself as Antillean or West Indian. The Negro lives in Africa. Subjectively, intellectually, the Antillean conducts himself like a white man, but he's a Negro. That he will learn once he goes to Europe. And when he hears Negroes mentioned, he will recognize that the world includes himself as well as the Senegalese. What are we to conclude on this matter? So he's saying, this is what colonization does to us in the group. It makes us think that we're white. It makes us think that we're white. We start thinking that we're white and that we're different from other Africans. And that those are the real savages. Until you're confronted with that racism, the way the folks in Martinique were when the French came to Martinique during World War II, or when folks from Martinique go to France to study and they realize, oh, wait, they're treating me just like they're treating the Africans from Africa. They think I'm a savage. But no, I've been told since the time I was young that I'm a Frenchman. So it creates this psychopathology in the mind. And Fanon says the only way to rid black, because he said we have if you're a black person living in a colonized situation, we're collectively pathological. Not because it's our fault, but the environment creates these fractured psyches among black people. And the only way to get out of that is national liberation. It's to end colonization. That is the remedy. In order for us to fix our minds, our collective minds, now some of us individually might be able to change, but for black folks collectively to get our minds right, we got to end colonization. So he decides, and if you want to read about Fanon, Lewis Gordon, Dr. Lewis Gordon is perhaps the most important Fanon scholar. So there's a ton of books on Fanon, YouTube videos on Fanon. So if you want to learn about Fanon, look up any YouTube videos about Dr. Lewis Gordon, and you'll be able to learn from Fanon. And he wrote 2 good books, Fanon, A Critical Reader, and What Fanon Said. And there are a number of readings by Fanon that are on our course website. So if you want to really go in depth about what he said and what he wrote, you can find that information on our course website. His 2 major works, like I already mentioned, Black Skin, White Mask, published in 1952, written in 1951, published in 1952, and The Wretched of the Earth, published in 1961. But in between these, he writes A Dying Colonialism in 1959 about what's happening in Algeria. So let me go back. Let me connect this. How he gets to Algeria. After World War II, like I said, he gets his medical degree in psychiatry, and then he starts working in Algeria as a psychiatrist. And this is at the beginnings of, this is after 1954. It's the beginnings of the national liberation struggle in Algeria. And Fanon is treating the French soldiers that are fighting the Algerians as well as treating the Algerians. He's treating people that have been victims of torture and the psychological effects of torture, as well as treating the torturers who are also having their own, what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorders from torturing people. So he's seeing both sides in his practice. And he realizes not long that he needs to be on the side of the Algerians. Even though he's from Martinique, he's from the Caribbean, he sees that this is where the struggle is. And he writes this fantastic letter of resignation from his post, and he ends up joining the FLN. First, he does so clandestinely. But then later on, he openly joins the FLN and becomes one of its leading propagandists. So he writes essays and articles talking about the Algerian Revolution, connecting it to the other revolutions occurring in Africa. He attends a number of important meetings, like the first Festival of African Writers. Was a big negritude festival organized by Elion Jope and others, and James Baldwin was there, and Leopold Senghor and others. Cheikh Anta Diop from Senegal, the great African historian, was there. And Fanon gives this paper about the struggle in Algeria and connecting freedom struggles to the struggle to liberate our minds. So he writes this book, A Dying Colonialism, in 1959, and he writes about the fighting that's occurring, because as he's writing, the war in Algeria has gotten even more intense. France sends hundreds of thousands of troops into Algeria because France is trying to support its settler population that doesn't want to give up Algeria. France can't afford to give up Algeria, so they want to hold on to it by any means. And they bring in hundreds of thousands of troops to fight in Algeria. They bring in anti-guerrilla war specialists who really up the torture in Algeria, who up the repression of the civilian population in Algeria, which just in turn makes the people more sympathetic to the FLN. And the FLN gets stronger and stronger as the French get more and more repressive. He writes, the Algerian nation is no longer in a future heaven. It is no longer the product of hazy, fantasy-ridden imaginations. It is at the very center of the new Algerian man. There is a new kind of Algerian man, a new dimension to his existence. The thesis that men change at the same time they change the world has never been so manifest as it is now in Algeria. This trial of strength not only remodels the consciousness that man has of himself and of his former dominators or of the world at last within his reach. This is one of the main ideas of Fanon. It is struggle that produces a new man. It is the struggle to free your nation that people can regain, they can become psychologically healthy. It's through struggle. The more violent the struggle, particularly against settler colonialism, the more healthy you'll become. And this idea of connecting struggle with psychological well-being is Fanon's gift to us. And he's going to be read by African revolutionaries all over the world. He's going to become the representative of Algeria in Ghana in 1960. So 1954, he joins the FLN. 1960, he's the ambassador, and they hadn't got independence yet. So the FLN is pretty much a government in exile. The masses support it, but independence hasn't been gained. So they're appointing ambassadors, and he's in Ghana because Ghana is what Nkrumah wanted it to be. It's the center and the place where African revolutionaries who are fighting from all over the continent can come, can get training, can get supplies, get support to carry on their revolution. So it's really important that he's in Ghana. Like I said, Ghana under Nkrumah, and he brought George Padmore from Trinidad with him. Shirley Graham Du Bois and W.E.B. Du Bois lived in Ghana before he passed away in 1963. Maya Angelou's in Ghana. You got revolutionaries from South Africa, from Zimbabwe, from Kenya, from Tanzania, from all over the African world that are in Ghana, sharing ideas, getting support. And Nkrumah and his advisor on African affairs, George Padmore of Trinidad, organized the All-African People's Conferences in 1958, 59, and 1960, 1961, that were bringing all these groups together. And Fanon was there. Fanon gives a speech because now the African struggle is slowly moving from colonies getting choices like what the French gave to West Africa, or colonies getting free like Nigeria and Ghana, where it was very little violence, to a more violent struggle. And Fanon says, this is the future. If we want the Africa that we want, we're gonna have to get down. We're gonna have to fight these settlers in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Kenya. The struggle had already been going in Kenya with the Land and Freedom Army that the British called the Mau Mau. So this is where the struggle is taking us. And he had to, push this line because at the beginning, Nkrumah was kind of like, maybe we can do this non-violently. It worked in Ghana, but Fanon saying that's not going to work in settler colonies. And eventually, Nkrumah is going to come to this conclusion himself. And he writes a book called The Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, but we'll get to that in a second. So these African People's Conferences were incredibly important. While all this is going on and African countries are getting independence slowly and slowly and slowly, and Algeria finally does get independence in 1962, the French realize that they can't hold on to Algeria. The white settlers in France the white settlers in Algeria, the French settlers in Algeria realized that the French are actually going to negotiate with the FLN for independence. So they start engaging in terrorist attacks in France. So think about this. The white settlers in Algeria who want to hold on to Algeria start engaging in terrorism in the heartland of France to show that we want the French to still support us. This, again, backfired. And the French said, you know what? This is causing too many problems. We're ending it. And in 1962, after at least 1 million Algerians died in this struggle and tens of thousands of French soldiers died, Algeria gets independence. The sad part is Fanon doesn't live to see Algeria get independence. Fanon dies of leukemia actually in the United States in 1961. And there's a whole lot of mystery surrounding that because it's a CIA operative that takes Fanon from Africa to the US for treatment for his leukemia, and he dies, but not before publishing his great work, The Wretched of the Earth, which he is pretty much writing on his deathbed. It's actually published after his death. But this is going to become a handbook, a linchpin of revolutionary literature in the 1960s and 70s. But I'll get to that. But while all this is going on, Africans in the United States and Canada and the Caribbean are watching these African countries get independence, and they want to support. In the United States, we have something called the African Committee on Africa, the American Committee on Africa, which is about fighting for decolonization, lobbying for independence, as well as to put an end to apartheid in South Africa. And one of the people that are on this committee is the man that was at Ghana's independence, Martin Luther King Jr. When we come back, and we're going to take a short Q&A, maybe 10 minutes. When we come back, we're going to talk about Harlem as being a place where a lot of these movements connected outside of Africa. And you had events like the rally by the American Committee on Africa, where people like Kwame Nkrumah were there, Adam Clayton Powell, Malcolm X, leaders from independence in countries that had gotten independence, and also movements that were fighting for independence, were able to use Harlem and use New York, which was the seat of the UN, to come, to strategize, to tell Africans in the United States what was going on in Africa. The Africans in the United States could tell the new African countries what was going on in their fight for civil rights. And a lot of this African exchange was happening in the place that Garvey built. And we're going to talk about, or Daniel's going to talk about when we come back from break, one of the key figures that brought all of this energy together in Harlem. So we'll stop there for a second. And Daniel, let me know what's in the chat, or folks can raise their hand. And this is being recorded. Anything in the chat?
There is nothing in the chat, but,
okay.
But Mr. Thomas has his hands up. Mr. Thomas, go ahead.
Morning, Mark. That's what I did. I wonder if you could shed some light as to how the West Indies, particularly Barbados, Trinidad, and Jamaica, were able to get independence in around the same time frame that we're discussing this morning. And it seems to have been blood-free.
Yeah, it's the same type of thing. The British realized after World War II that they weren't going to be able to have colonies the same way that they were before. The movements were too strong. In those countries, the independence movement was happening. They were connected with many of the leaders were talking to the African countries, and they were successful in advocating for this. But the British were slick, just like the French. They say, okay, we can reformulate this so that we can still get the resources and the economic benefits of this without calling it colonization. So we'll let you lower the British flag. We'll let you put up your own flag. We'll let you have your own anthem, but we'll make you a part of the Commonwealth. We'll make you a part of this, that, and the third, and we'll sign all these agreements that essentially you're free, but we still control your mind because we still have the curriculum. We still control your economies. We still control this, that, and the third. So it's independence, but is it really independence? And this is a question that we have to ask from most places, because what the British did, they just moved into neocolonialism. So that's independence in name, but in essence, if someone controls your economy, and even if somebody controls your curriculum, and that means they mess with our leaders' minds so much, some of our leaders' minds so much, that even when they leave, we're still teaching about them and teaching their history. If that's the case, are you really free? So yeah, a lot of what was going on in the Caribbean and what was going on in Africa, same type of movements are occurring. Yeah, thank you for that.
As a matter of fact, it seems as if to say the United States did more harm land good after many of the West Indian countries were so-called independent.
That's true, because that's the other thing, and we're going to really talk about that next week, because what happens is the British and the French are weakened after World War II, and now we get the rise of the US and the Soviet Union as the two remaining superpowers. So as these countries, all of these countries are getting independence, and in 1955, they have a really important meeting for world history called the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, where the African countries and their representatives, the Asian countries and their representatives, and the countries in Latin America are there to talk about what the world is going to look like. And they want to create something called the non-aligned movement, where they say we're not going to be a part of what the US wants to do or what the Soviet Union wants to do. But that didn't really work out practically, because after World War II, the US basically said, hey, if you're not with us, you're with the Soviets, and we're going to treat you like an enemy. So if you want economic aid, if you want cooperation, you need to show that you're not communist, that you're not socialist, that you're willing to let US investment come into your places. And we're essentially going to take the place of Britain and France for somewhat in this new world order. We're the new big dogs on the block. So we're going to talk about the role that US and to a lesser extent Canada play next week, because as these countries get independence, is not happening without severe interference by former colonial powers, and then in these new neo-colonial powers of the United States, and to a lesser extent Canada. So we'll talk about that next week. Other questions? Any more hands up, Daniel?
I don't see any hands, but somebody just asked, what would you say are the most common factors contributing to bloodshed freedom from colonization versus the most common factors leading to freedom through bloodshed?
It's the main one. It's settlers. If there are settlers there, you're not going to get free without bloodshed. That's because in the mentality of the settler, it's their land. So when you got British troops taking land from Africans in Zimbabwe after World War II, the British, one of their ways of thanking their soldiers for fighting in their tribal war was to award them cheap land in what was then Southern Rhodesia. So a lot of the folks that are still in Zimbabwe today, there's still white farmers there. A lot of them came in the 30s and 40s, particularly in the 40s and 50s after World War II. So they come with the mentality that I own the title to this land. It's mine. It's my family's. And I will fight for it for the death. Same thing in Kenya. Same thing in South Africa. Same thing in Algeria. They said the land belongs to them. And the Africans who have been dispossessed of the land, whose ancestors are literally buried in the land, it's a different type of fight versus a white colonial official who's living in Nigeria, who doesn't really want to be there. They've been assigned there. It's hot. There's mosquitoes. They're just like, I'm here. I don't care if we don't have Nigeria anymore, because then they realize, well, we can still control the economy in Nigeria. We can still use British petroleum and shale, and we can still control the oil production without actually calling it a colony. And we don't have settlers there, so it's easy to just say, here's your independence. Put up your own flag, have your own national anthem. But guess what? There's still British companies there. There's still British financial interests. So it's fine that you have your own country, and you have the land anyway. I mean, the land that doesn't produce oil. So fine. But where there's settlers, there will be violence, and that's the main thing. Yeah, that's the main ingredient. All right, good questions. So I'm going to turn it over. So for Daniel, go ahead and let us know about what was going on in Harlem and one of the key figures that were bringing all of these ideas together. A figure that a lot of folks might not have heard about.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, right, so we are going to be speaking about this gentleman right here, Carlos Cooks. He came out of the Garvey movement and continued Garveyism in Harlem at a time when most people forgot who Garvey was or never heard of him in the first place. So we're going to speak about that. Some very quick introduction. He was born on June 23rd, 1913 in the Dominican Republic. He was a Garveyite, he was a Pan-African. He was a street orator and a soapbox speaker. So those were people who would stand on the streets and speak about Black nationalism and any affairs concerning the African American community of the day. He was a member of the UNIA and another group called the Universal African Nationalist Movement. We'll get to that shortly. He founds an offshoot of the UNIA called the UNIA Advanced Division, and then he later forms the African Nationalist Pioneer Movement. So we're going to skip through the historiography. We could come back to that if we have time. So we've already spoken about Marcus Garvey, so I'll just run through this pretty quickly. Born in St. Ann's Bay, Jamaica on August 17, 1887, founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association. In the Caribbean, there were 5 branches of the UNIA set up in the Dominican Republic. Carlos Cooks' father, James Henry Cooks, was responsible for founding one of these branches. Specifically, he formed the UNIA branch in San Pedro de Macorís. This chapter was headquartered at his house, so Carlos Cooks was getting exposed to Garveyism firsthand under his own roof. His father and his uncle would take him to UNIA meetings at their house pretty frequently. The UNIA in all parts of the world was heavily monitored by the colonial world. So James Cooks was harassed by the colonial administrators and the Dominican for being associated with the Garvey movement. So several members of this branch were arrested, and James was forced to leave the Dominican Republic in March 1922 to come to Harlem. Carlos Cooks follows suit 7 years later in 1929 at the age of 16. In the 1930s, Carlos Cooks forms the UNIA Advanced Division. He finds that a lot of the people who were talking about Garveyism were either lying or were using Garvey's name to suit their own interests. And so he basically forms the Advanced Division to keep Garveyism authentic and unmolested from outside influence. So he becomes president in 1938, and there's some other men who become prominent in that movement. We have Charles Eugene Smith, who was the first lieutenant. We have John Sibley, who was the Minister of Propaganda. And we have Rufus Waldo Williams, who was the education director. And he's a very interesting person because as far back as the 1930s, we have somebody who's teaching Black people Swahili. Rufus Williams was very fluent in Swahili as well as Spanish and French, and he was teaching Black people in the UNIA how to speak this African language at a time when most Black people didn't even know where Africa was in the world. So pretty significant person right there. They had the street speaker as the official literary organ of the Advanced Division, and that would later translate to the African Nationalist Pioneer Movement. And the organization lasted until about 1941 due to petty differences. We'll go ahead and skip through this. Carlos Cooks was very big on continuing Marcus Garvey's ideas of back to Africa. There was a senator from Mississippi named Theodore Bilbo. He was racist, he was pro-segregation, anti-race mixing, and he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. In May 1938, he made a proposal for a Back to Africa bill that would send African Americans to Liberia. Marcus Garvey was very vocal about supporting this bill. So at the 8th International UNIA Conference, he spoke about getting his organization to support this bill. When that happened, he appointed Carlos Cooks to personally send a delegation to DC to speak with him. And Charles Eugene Smith actually gives an account of how that trip went. They left for DC on September 13th, 1938. And really quickly, I'll just read to you what Charles Smith said about that event. He said, Wednesday night, September 13th, 1939, Captain Cook, Captain Parks, First Lieutenant Smith, and Mr. Wiltshire, Commercial Deputy-in-Chief, sent out to Washington. Our means of conveyance were very crude. After 4 hours of winding and traveling blindly in a miserable, springless, bumpy Chevy, we finally got to Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, they are not fond of black patronage in white restaurants. When I say black or blacks, I mean Negro. As we pulled into a luncheon place on the wayside, sorry, let me move this. Okay, sorry about that. When I say black or blacks, I mean Negro. As we pulled into a luncheon on the wayside, remarks were muttered by whites sitting around. We easily recognized the unwelcome attitude of our onlookers. Nothing grew out of the low muttering, grazing, and it was lucky, for we were prepared not to take any foolishness. We had coffee and set out again. We got lost about half a dozen times or more, but somehow got out of Philadelphia. We accidentally found ourselves on the road to Baltimore. We stopped many times to gas up and look over our crude means of travel. We had traveled all night, and we now noticed the sun began to peep over the horizon. A great difference in climatic atmosphere was noticed by us all. This must be the dividing line between the Yankee and the Southern atmosphere, remarked Mr. Wiltshire. We had a laugh at his remark. We succeeded in reaching Baltimore after many mishaps about breakfast time. We invited the guests to have a bite with us. This fellow informed us of bad living conditions among the blacks of this city. To further substantiate this claim, we were eyewitnesses to some very unsanitary surroundings, such as salons, restaurants, and localities in which they lived. After feasting our eyes on everything that might prove of interest, we journeyed to Washington. We arrived at the state capitol about 10:30 a.m. It was 10 minutes to 11 when we got inside the Senate, and an information clerk directed us to Senator Bilbo's office. We were admitted entrance after identifying ourselves as the committee of the Advanced Division of the UNIA. The senator arose from his chair and greeted the whole committee with a hearty handshake. He was very regular in his address. I am Bilbo, he said. He inquired of our names. He led us into his private chamber and took his seat behind his long desk. The chairman of our committee handed the senator the letter we had drafted. He read carefully every phrase and hinted of a few things mentioned. The senator asked if we could remain overnight. We told him we were forced to leave the same night. It was time for lunch. The senator arose and told us we should return at 3 p.m. We departed from the Senate, and I decided to take the boys to Fort Myers, Virginia. We had lunch in Fort Myers, and after I had met some of the boys that I had known on the border, we decided to return to the Senate. We reached the door at exactly 3 p.m. We knocked at the door and were admitted. Senator took us again in his private chamber and took his usual seat. We seated ourselves around his desk when he addressed our chairman, saying, "Go on, what have you to say?" Our chairman began by saying, "I have a plan to bring 5,000 Negroes to Washington when your bill is presented." This plan was fully discussed. The senator saw the good of such a plan. 3 points were mentioned in our draft. These points were argued and fully discussed. When the senator was about to conclude the conference, he said, "I think you have what I want. I will get you boys started as soon as Congress is over." He arose and each of us signed the document. The senator concluded his conference with us. We departed feeling sure we had scored all 3 points included in our draft. Senator Bilbo is a great authority on the race question. The bill introduced by him substantiates that claim. So when Carlos Cooks and the UNIA get back to Harlem, they talk about how this meeting went, and the success behind it was so inspiring that the UNIA Advanced Division was bombarded with new applications, and consequently they were forced to buy a new building to accommodate all the new members. So now we get to the to Carlos Cook's organization. After paying his Cooks caused the UNIA to fracture, Carlos Cooks formed the African Nationalist Pioneer Movement, or ANPM, on his 28th birthday, June 23rd, 1941. Several members of the UNIA came back with them, such as Rufus Williams, who we've already said was the education director. We have Charles Peaker, who was Carlos Cook's best friend and right-hand man. We have Mary Kerr, who was in charge of the Ladies Auxiliary. And we have Charles Eugene Smith, who we've just seen. Carlos Cooks modeled the ANPM exactly how Marcus Garvey did. That was through three main segments, which was the organization proper, the economic department, and the repatriation agency. He copied the military wing of the UNIA and incorporated that into his organization and called it the African Nationalist Legion. The ANPM had a ladies auxiliary as well as a school of African language and culture. He also organized the Marcus Garvey Day Parade, which was held every August 17th at 5 o'clock p.m. So here's a picture of one of the first Marcus Garvey Day parades. Got this picture from the archives of Duke University. Here's a picture of the Legion. Here's another picture of the Legion, and this is Charles Peaker right here in the back. So during World War II, Carlos Cooks gave a speech declaring that Adolf Hitler was a good white man for organizing white people to kill each other. The government decided to arrest Carlos Cooks for this, for these anti-Semitic statements, and gave him the option of serving in the war or getting drafted and deported from the United States. He chose the latter, and he was taken to trial for his anti-Semitic statements. And according to the New York Times, his lawyer said that his defense cost him the most embarrassment in his 21 years of practice, but he attributed Cooks' remarks to developments in the war. So Carlos Cooks decided to fight in the war instead of getting deported. When he did this, he was active throughout the United States, North Africa, and Europe. He had no military experience, so the US government was hoping that he'd get killed off on the war. But unfortunately for them, he showed up at an American base a few days after getting lost on the battlefield. When he comes back from World War II in 1945, he's consulted by other Black nationalists to form a new group called the Universal African Nationalist Movement. During the 1940s, they also sent a delegation to DC to talk about repatriation, but they were told that the government would have no part in such an affair, but that they wouldn't stop them if they tried to do so themselves. So when they get back to New York, Carlos Cooks begins to draw plans for an African colonization society. However, he gets kicked out of the group when he refuses to accept help from a communist Jew who wanted to help them with the project. He argued that Black nationalism relied on African cooperation exclusively, and that meant that no non-Black person could help in any Black endeavors. That was too much for the organization, and they decided to let him go. So after getting expelled in 1949, he reinitiates the ANPM. During the 1950s, they start working on several projects. In 1952, they invite a famous Sierra Leonean dancer to their Marcus Garvey Day parade. In 1954, they begin working on a building in tribute to Marcus Garvey. And then in 1959, they hold a convention to abrogate the word Negro. And we'll get back to that pretty shortly. So the Marcus Garvey Memorial Building was conceptualized to be a future headquarters for the organization. They submitted the blueprints to New York City on June 1st, 1960. However, New York City went through great lengths to prevent the building from getting finished. Even though they submitted the blueprints in 1960, it was not until 1962 that the blueprints were taken into consideration. And even then, that was only after Carlos Cooks started taking the court. When they did start to cooperate, New York City gave the ANPM Uncle Tom for a contractor and used thousands of organizational funds for work that he didn't do. And so ultimately the ANPM had to become their own contractor and employ people themselves to get the building done because New York City wasn't being cooperative. When the building was finished, it had a large black map of the continent of Africa, which we see right here on the building. It was also designed to have no windows at the front to prevent vandalism. Unfortunately, in 1970, New York City had the building demolished. And so when you see brothers right here cleaning up the debris of the building, that's why. Okay, so we briefly talked about how Marcus Garvey had the All African Peoples Conference in 1920 to have African representatives all come to Harlem and speak about issues that they were facing in their own communities. Carlos Cooks decided to build upon that and hold an All African Peoples Conference of his own in 1959. The main goal of this conference was to abrogate the word Negro. These are their goals and objectives here. We can just skip over those, but ultimately the end result of the conference was to abrogate the term Negro from English literature and vocabulary for all time. The ANPM was basically arguing that the word Negro was really closely associated with the word nigger, and so to use it as a term to refer to Black people was ultimately disrespectful and insulting. We can skip past this. During the 1960s, this is when we start to see Carlos Cooks working with African politicians and start to see him start to work with people internationally. In 1960, the ANPM held receptions for several African politicians, and we'll get to that shortly. In 1961, they held a rally for Angolan politician Porter Roberto. In 1963, they boycott a white-owned wig shop. And in 1964, they write a letter to the President of the United States, and we will talk about that as well. So Samuel Juma is the first president of the country we now call Namibia. In 1960, he formed a group called the Southwest Africa's People Organization, or SWAPO. According to his autobiography, Where Others Wavered, he came to Harlem in June 1960 to speak with the United Nations. And he says while they were in Harlem, quote, "We were greatly helped by Marcus Garvey's African pioneer movement and by George Hauser of the American Committee on Africa, who remained our friends throughout the long and bitter struggle. When he came to Harlem, Carlos Cooks organized a fundraiser and clothes drive to support Namibia and their cause." And this is actually one of the advertisements they had for that fundraiser and clothes drive in one of their publications. After Samuel Juma, we have Patrice Lumumba, who was the first prime minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo. He came to Harlem in July to speak with the United Nations, and while he was there, there was a forum held for him in Harlem. The ANPM and Nation of Islam were in the forefront of the affair. After the reception was over, Lumumba personally invited Carlos Cooks to come back to Africa with him. However, he felt that his job was to stay in America, prepare Africans to get ready to go to Africa, and so he had to respectfully turn down that offer. After him was Fidel Castro, the Prime Minister of Cuba.
Welcome to BIA.